Hilchos Shofar v'Sukkah v'Lulav Perek Chamishi. The laws of Shofar, Sukkah, and Lulav, chapter 5. Today we continue the laws of Sukkah. The first 3 chapters were about the Shofar. Yesterday we began to learn the laws about the walls of the Sukkah, and today we move on to the Schach, the laws of the covering of the Sukkah. Of course, this is a classic graphic of a Sukkah, where when you envision the top, the covering of a Sukkah, you envision some greenery. In California, it's customary, people use palm trees. In New York, they use pine, some kind of a growing thing. Of course, very common today are the bamboo mats, which we'll also have a chance to discuss later today. And that's what we're talking about today, the covering of the Sukkah, the laws that govern the cover of the Sukkah. There was a technical issue on my end where I wasn't able to put in visuals for the second half of the chapter. Something happened with the program that I use. So we have images for the first half, and then for the second half, I'll just try to provide from the images that they print here in the Moznaim Rambam, the beautiful Moznaim Rambam, which we use each day to study. But be that as it may, without further ado, let's get right to it. Halacha Aleph. Says the Rambam, Haschach shel Sukkah einoi kosher mikol davar. The schach, the covering of the Sukkah, is not kosher from just any material. And the Rambam here is contrasting, because the very last paragraph of yesterday's chapter, he said, Dofnei Sukkah ksherin min hakol. The walls of the Sukkah can be made from any material. So he contrasts and says, the schach of the Sukkah, no, that's not kosher from every material. There are 5 governing principles that have to be met in order to make kosher schach. Ein mesakhin, says the Rambam, we may not use for a cover of the Sukkah ella only, number 1, bedavar shegidule min haaretz, something which grows from the ground. Number 2, shene'ekar min haaretz, it was then detached from the ground. Ve'enoi mekabel tuma, and in its current state, it is not susceptible to ritual impurity. In the 10th book of the Rambam, it's all about the laws of ritual impurity. We learn about many different types of materials that can contract different types of ritual impurity. Impurity given by a corpse, by a rodent, by impure liquids or objects. Depending on the type of material, the Torah says whether it can contract ritual impurity or not. Certain types of unformed utensils, just a block of wood, let's say, is not susceptible to ritual impurity. But once you make a receptacle out of it, a functioning vessel, now that becomes susceptible. Just one example of many. So the Rambam says whatever you're using for schach cannot be, in its current state, susceptible to ritual impurity. That's number 3. Number 4, ve'ein reicha ra, it doesn't smell bad. And number 5, ve'enoi noisher ve'enoi noivel tamid, it does not have elements or leaves which consistently fall off or wither. Those are the 5 requirements. Growing from the ground, detached from the ground, not susceptible to impurity, doesn't smell bad, and doesn't constantly fall off. We're going to see in a moment that the first 3 are biblical requirements. The last 2 are rabbinic. And so after the fact, if they weren't met, it's okay. Says the Rambam halacha beis, sikech bedavar she'en gidulav min haaretz. If you did make sechach, make a covering for the sukkah with something which does not grow from the ground, or something that was attached to the ground even if it grows from the ground, or with something that is susceptible to ritual impurity, psula. In this case, since you violated a biblical issue here, so the whole sukkah is disqualified. But if you went ahead, transgressed, and made a covering for the sukkah with something that has leaves or elements that are constantly falling off, or something which smells bad, the sukkah nevertheless remains kosher. Because the only reason the sages said not to use these materials as schach, is not because there's an inherent problem in the schach, but because we're worried that if you had such schach with stuff falling down or a bad smell, that would cause you to leave the sukkah. And therefore, for the same reason, we have to be careful that even if you have a kosher covering, make sure the leaves and the branches do not extend into the airspace lower than 10 tfachim from the ground where people usually sit and actually eat. So it shouldn't bother your sitting in the sukkah. The first 3 are inherent to the schach. The schach itself cannot be something which doesn't grow from the ground or is attached to the ground or is susceptible to ritual impurity. If you violate those conditions, you're out. The other 2 are only to avoid a side problem. So therefore, at the end of the day, after the fact, it'll be kosher. Let's go into some other specific examples. If you covered a sukkah with types of metal, or with bone, or with hides of an animal, psula, the sukkah is disqualified. Because those things do not grow from the ground. Hidla aleha gefanim v'chayetze ben. If you were to drape over growing vines over your sukkah and to make schach out of that, I couldn't find a picture of grapevines, but here you have a picture of a pumpkin vine. This is an actual sukkah. Pumpkin vine is growing next to it, and you drape the vines over the sukkah. Ad shanasu sukkah, till they become a sukkah, a covering. Psula, this is disqualified. Sharei loy nekru, because the vines, in their current state, haven't been detached from the ground. Even though they grow from the ground, they're still attached. If you were to cover the sukkah with receptacles, utensils of wood, or with mats that are typically made for sleeping on, or something like that, psula, the sukkah is also disqualified. These things grow from the ground, the wood grew from the ground, they're detached from the ground. So what's the problem? Because they are susceptible in their current state to ritual impurity. Same thing applies if you covered a sukkah with broken utensils or worn out utensils. It's disqualified. Now we're going to learn in the 10th book of the Rambam that there are certain points at which, when a utensil breaks to that point, it is rid of the possibility to become impure. So one would think that if you have a broken utensil, it should be kosher to use as schach, because now it's no longer susceptible to ritual impurity. Nevertheless, the Rambam clarifies, Hayil v'hayu mikablin tuma. Since they used to be, before they were broken, in a state of susceptibility to ritual impurity, Shema yisakech bishvarim sha'adayin lo'taharu, we're worried that a person may come to use broken pieces of a utensil that aren't broken to the point where the susceptibility is removed. They're only broken to a point which is partial, and they're still susceptible. So because we're worried that you might use susceptible utensils, the rabbi said in all cases of broken utensils, in all cases of worn out utensils, do not use them for schach, and if you do, the sukkah is pasul, disqualified. Gimel, sikcha ba'ichlin psula. If you covered your sukkah with food grows from the ground, produce, fruit, it's detached from the ground, nevertheless it's disqualified, same reason, because food can become susceptible to ritual impurity. There's a whole section of laws in the 10th book of the Rambam, which we'll get to, God willing, which is all about the laws that govern food's susceptibility to ritual impurity. And by default they are. And so, you cannot use them for schach. What if you use the mixture? You have branches from a fig tree with figs on them. Runners from a grapevine with grapes on them. Palm branches on which there are dates. Or any similar situation. What do you look at? Do you look at the branch? The branch is good, grows from the ground, detached from the ground, not susceptible to ritual impurity. But the food on the branch is susceptible. So the Rambam says, Royan, we check. If the unedible part, the branch, is more in quantity than the food, you can use it for schach. We don't worry about the fact that there's also food on the branch. But if not, we do not use them for schach. If you used as a covering for your sukkah such vegetables, leafy vegetables, that if left to dry, they would wither and crumble, and nothing would be left of them. Even if right now the lettuce leaves are beautifully moist and fresh, the place that they occupy is considered to be airspace, as if they're not existent. And when you have airspace in your sukkah, it's not so simple, because sukkah has to be more shade than sun. As we're going to learn later on in this chapter, the laws that govern open airspace on the covering of your sukkah. But basically, if you have such leafy vegetables on your sukkah, since they're going to dry out and become nothing, they're treated right now from the outset as if they're just open airspace. And again, we'll see the laws that govern open airspace in the end of the chapter. Dalid sikha bepishte ha'etz. If you covered your sukkah with raw flax, shaloi dak oisan v'loi niptzan, which hasn't been combed and hasn't been beaten. We saw a number of times already in the Rambam that the flax would go through a process before it was turned into material. It would be beaten, it would be combed, it would be soaked. You cut it off of its growth source. You haven't done any processing to it yet. The Rambam says it's treated as wood. Kshera, it's kosher for a sukkah covering. Sha'adayin eitzu, because it's literally still wood. The imdak v'nipetz, but if you had beaten them or combed them, ein mesakhin by. Now you can no longer use it for schach, because its form has changed. And it's as though it no longer is considered to be something which grows from the ground. We treat it differently. Now it's fabric, now it's material. We may cover our sukkah with rope made out of palm bast or hemp. This is a picture of hemp. I know it can evoke images of marijuana, and apparently the plants are related. But this is the hemp plant. And fascinatingly, from the stalks of this hemp plant, you make this material. a beautiful fabric. So if you made a rope, not a piece of clothing, but if you made a rope out of palm bast or out of hemp, or anything like that, that's allowed to be used for a covering of a sukkah. The form is still intact, it hasn't changed form, like the beaten flax. And ropes are not utensils. They're not susceptible to ritual impurity, only utensils are. So, everything about them is kosher, all the boxes are checked, and you can use them for a covering of a sukkah. Hey, sikkacha bechitzim. If you covered your sukkah with arrows, not like today, our arrows are much more technologically advanced, but in the olden times, there was a metal arrow head that would go at the edge of a wooden arrow. And so the arrow itself seemingly met all the criteria. It grows from the ground, it's wood, it's detached from the ground. The question is it a utensil? So this depends how the arrow was formed. In those times, they used to have what's called the male arrows and female arrows. Male arrows were where the wooden piece had the protrusion at the end, which would go into a hole in the arrowhead. Female arrows were where the arrowhead had the protrusion, and they would go into an indent made in the wooden piece of the arrow. In that case, the wood is kind of like a utensil. It has a hole for the arrowhead to go inside. So the Rambam says, Bizcharim, if you used male wooden pieces of the arrow, kshera, your sukkah is kosher, because those pieces of arrow are not a utensil, and so there are no problems with them. Binikevos, but if you use the female arrows, psula, it's disqualified. Afal pishu asili hismalis bebarzal, even though the indent in it will ultimately be filled up with the metal, the iron piece of the arrowhead, base kibulhu, for the moment it's considered to be a receptacle, umekabel tumak echol kli kibul, and it's susceptible to ritual impurity like any other utensil would be. And therefore, it cannot be used for schach. Vav, says the Rambam, machzelas kanim and machzelas gmi oichelef. A mat made out of reeds, or a mat made out of raw rubber, or out of hemp. So we already mentioned mats before, in the basic context that if they're made for sleeping on, they're considered to be a utensil, susceptible to ritual impurity, and cannot be used for schach. Now the Rambam elaborates. He says, here's the law about mats. Ktana stama lishchiva. A small mat, by default, it can be assumed that it was made for sleeping. Lefichach ein mesakchin ba, and therefore you cannot use it for schach, to cover a sukkah. Elohim kain asa oisa l'sikoch, unless you fashioned it to begin with, to be used as schach. Gedola, however, a big mat, stama l'sikoch. By default, it can be assumed that it was made for schach, to be used as a covering of a sukkah. Lefichach mesakchin ba, Elohim kain asa oisa l'shchiva. Therefore, you can use it for schach unless you purposely stipulated that you're making it for a massive bed. Of course, today our bamboo mats that we use for sukkahs are expressly made with the intent to be used for covering sukkahs, and therefore they don't have a problem. The Yesh Lakir says that if there's a rim going around the mat, afilu gedoyle in mesakchin ba, even if it's a big one, which by default is assumed to be used for schach, you cannot use it for schach. The added rim makes it into a utensil, a receptacle which can hold stuff. That makes it susceptible to ritual impurity. Even if you then go ahead and remove the rim, ein mesakchin ba, you can no longer use it for schach, because now it assumes the status of a broken utensil. And we already saw before that the rabbi said all broken utensils are out. Once they were in a state of susceptibility, for sukkah issues, they never leave that state, and you cannot use them for schach. Zayin, says the Rambam, nisarim. What about using boards? Straight up boards, pieces of wood, 2x4s, 2x8s. Says the Rambam, the rule for using boards as schach goes like this. You can kind of see it over here. I just got a picture of a regular pergola, because many sukkahs, you see this. They have 2x4s that are supporting the schach. And that's not a problem, because they don't have the issues the Rambam is about to describe. You could actually have wooden boards as part of your sukkah covering, so long as they meet the criteria, which are, she'ein berach ban arba'a tfachim, if they do not have a width of 4 tfachim, 4 hand widths, about 12 to 16 inches. Mesakchin b'hen, you can use them for schach, afal pi she'ein meshupin, even if they're plain down, they're smooth. They look like stuff you would use for a regular roof. Not a permanent, not a temporary covering for a sukkah. Doesn't matter. If it's not that big, you can use the board for schach. On the other hand, once the boards have a width of 4 tfachim, you cannot use them as the covering for the sukkah, even if they're not smooth. And they look raw. And they don't look like a permanent construction material. Doesn't matter. Gzeira, what is the reason that we cannot sit under a schach of boards that are 4 tfachim thick? It's a decree. Shema yeshev tachas hatikra v'idam shehi kesukkah. The sages were worried you're going to sit under your roof in your house and think it's a sukkah. After all, what's the difference? The boards in your house are thick. The boards in your sukkah are thick. It's called gzeirat tikra in the Talmud, the decree of the rooftop. We're worried. We don't want you to start thinking that a house is also a sukkah. So the rabbi said, once your boards are too wide, don't use them for the sukkah. What if you just had one board in your sukkah that was 4 tfachim wide? Everything else was proper, green, beautiful schach. And at the side of the sukkah, you put up a big board. So here the Rambam says, we don't make it so problematic. Ksheira, the sukkah is kosher. It's considered to be fully covered. That board is part of the covering. Ve'ein yeshenin tachta, but you cannot sleep under that board. If you do sleep under it, you haven't fulfilled your obligation because you're sleeping in an area which isn't a sukkah. Fascinating law. If you have boards that have a width of 4 tfachim thick, 4 tfachim wide, but their thickness isn't 4 tfachim. So you said, smart Jew, I'm not going to lay the boards flat, in which case when you look up, you'll see the 4 tfachim width. I'll put them on their side. And now, I don't have 4 tfachim covering my sukkah. I have less than 4 tfachim covering my sukkah. Says the Rambam, if you turn them on their sides, which do not have 4 tfachim, and you use them as a covering, it's a disqualified sukkah. Why? Because the board, by having a width of 4 tfachim, becomes inherently disqualified. Not circumstantially disqualified. Not just because it's sitting like this, now it's bad. If it has a width of 4 tfachim, the whole board is treated like, let's say, a piece of metal, which is ritually impure. It doesn't grow from the ground. It has their other problems. It becomes a problematic board. No matter where you put the schach, on the side of the width or on the side of the thickness. A roof which doesn't have a coating. We're not very familiar with this type of construction. We have a very advanced, thank God, construction today. But in olden times, it was a very simple, primitive way of building a home. You made a wooden structure with a roof of wooden boards, and on top of it, you would lay a layer of coating, some kind of clay or a mud to protect you from the elements. So the Rambam says, what happens if you have a roof of a house, regular structure, and you haven't put the top coating yet? So technically, you just have wooden boards, kosher schach, on your roof. Tikra she'ein aleha ma'aziva. If a roof doesn't have a ceiling, a coating over it, the plaster, the mud, the clay, and the stones. All it is a bunch of boards. It is nevertheless disqualified for use for a sukkah. And here we have a new law introduced. Not because there's a problem in the schach, but because this roof was not laid with the intent to be used as a sukkah. It was laid with the intent to be used as a home. Sukkah has got to be a temporary dwelling. Lefichach, therefore, if you took action, did something to this layer of boards, and showed that you want to use it for a sukkah, for example, in pikpek hanesarim, if you were to lift the boards, vehenid hamasmerim l'shem sukkah, and move the nails that are holding the boards down, with the intent that you now want to use them for a sukkah, harezuk sheder, now it's kosher, ubilvad shalayiyah b'chol neser b'neser arba tfachim, of course, provided that each board doesn't have a thickness or a width of 4 tfachim, which is problematic. V'chein, similarly, not lechan mibintayim. If you took out every second board, and in between you put, in its place, you put kosher schach, regular greenery or whatever, with the intent to be used for a sukkah, now it's kosher. And this ties into a law we're going to see in the end of the chapter, that if you have kosher schach and non-kosher schach side by side of equal amount, there's room to be lenient and make it kosher. Tes, sukkah shenasis ki hilchasa mikol makom. A sukkah that was made properly for any purpose. Ksheira, it's kosher. Afal pisha leinasis l'shem mitzvah. Even if it wasn't made for a mitzvah. We said before in the last halacha, it has to be made with the intent for a sukkah. That's a very operative word. It has to be made with the intent to be used as a sukkah, as a hut, as a protective hut, not for a home. But not for the mitzvah. It's not essential that the sukkah be made for the mitzvah. It has to be made for shade purposes. Like a sukkah that's made for an idol-worshipping Gentile or for an animal, anything like it. Doesn't matter. But it has to be made for shade. But if a sukkah came about on its own, psula, it's disqualified because it wasn't made for shade. You didn't construct the sukkah for shade. What does it mean a sukkah that came about on its own? He gives a few examples. Similarly, Somebody digs into a haystack. You have a haystack. Someone digs a hole in the haystack to be able to fit inside. The asahu sukkah, and thereby makes it into a sukkah. Ain't a sukkah. That's not a sukkah. You never gathered all the hay to be used for shade. You didn't construct it in this way for a shady place. You made a haystack and you dug into the haystack and created a sukkah on its own accord. No good. Lefichach, therefore, what's a workaround here? Im asa bitchila chalal tefach b'meshech shiva l'shem sukkah. If, when you created the haystack, at the bottom you left the surface area of a sukkah, 7 by 7 tvachim, 7 by 7 handbreadths, at the height of 1 tefach, a height of 1 handbreadth, we'll see in the 10th book of the Rambam at length, 1 handbreadth is considered to be an ohel. It's considered to be enough to be a space, a contained space. So long as you left 7 by 7 tvachim, which is the kosher length and width of a sukkah, at the height of a tefach, and then later on you dug more into the haystack and completed the requisite 10 tefachim height of the sukkah, now you have a kosher sukkah, because the covering at the time that it was initially made was made for shade. Yes, shade only for a space of a height of a tefach. Later on you added the proper height of 10 tefachim, but in the beginning you had a space that was made for shade, and therefore it's okay. Yod, returning now to other problematic schachs, problematic coverings. Chavile kash v'chavile eitzim v'chavile ezradim. Bundles of straw, bundles of wood, bundles of reeds. Ein mesakchin b'han. You cannot simply put them onto the roof of your sukkah as they are in bundles and use them for schach. Gzeira, because we're worried about a decree. Shema yaso eson chaviles al gaga kedili yapshan. Perhaps you're going to initially bring the bundles onto your roof to dry the bundles, not for the purpose of a sukkah. V'yimolech v'yeshiv tachtein l'shem sukkah. Then you're going to change your mind and you're going to say, hey, I have bundles on my roof. In my mind, convert it into schach. Initially, you hadn't made this schach to provide shade. And so it goes into the category of a sukkah which comes about on its own, treated as such, and a non-kosher sukkah. Of course, if you undid the bundles, now they're no longer bundles. Now they're kosher. Halachically, you should know what constitutes a bundle is no less than 25 units, 25 branches. Related to the laws of bundles, says the Rambam Yud Aleph, Chaviles ketanos she'ogdu esan leminyan. If you have small bundles that were simply made for counting purposes, how many dozen do I have? How many tens do I have? It wasn't meant to be a massive bundle. Misakchin b'hen, those can be used as chach in their bundle state, in their tied up state. Similarly, if someone were to cut off the top of a palm tree while all the branches are attached to it, couldn't find the picture depicting exactly that, but how about this? Palm tree falls over, and you can see that this part could be used for a sukkah. You have a sukkah under here. It's detached from the ground. It's growing from the ground, and now you have a whole bundle using it, sitting on top of your sukkah. The question is it considered a bundle? Is the fact that they're all in their bark, attached at their bottom, does that make them into a bundle? So the Rambam says mesakhin, but you can use it for schach. A bundle created by heaven, in other words, a natural bundle, isn't considered to be a bundle for the laws of sukkah. Even if you would then went ahead and tied the edges of all the other leaves at the other end, so you've made an active bundle, so you now have within one bundle one edge tied by heaven naturally on this side, one edge tied by a human being. Misakhin, but you can still use it for schach. And here there's an interesting rationale. If you tie down one log of wood, you haven't made a bundle. There's no bundle within one unit. And this head of the palm tree, v'zu ke'etz echadi. Halachically, we're going to treat this as one log of wood. Because it's tied up in the hands of heaven. It's naturally tied, so it's considered to be one unit. So when you make the bundle on the other side, you're essentially just tying down one log. And therefore you can use it for schach. Similarly, any knot or bundle which is not meant to be moved around, it's a very loose knot, and by simply transferring it, the whole thing would come apart. It's not considered to be a bundle, and so if you use it for schach, that's okay. Yud Beis. If somebody makes his sukkah under a tree, unfortunately a very common issue in today's sukkahs, people don't realize, you put up a sukkah in your driveway, there's a palm tree hanging over, the whole sukkah is disqualified. The Rambam says, somebody who makes a sukkah under the tree is as though he made it inside his home. It's quite an interesting expression of the Rambam here. This is the Mishnah's expression. The Mishnah says somebody makes a sukkah under a tree, it's as if he makes it in a home. The law being communicated is that it's disqualified. The Rambam, who is a legal book, you would expect him to be more explicit. Say, you make a sukkah under a tree, disqualified. It's pasul. Nevertheless, the Rambam uses the wording here that it's like a home. And the Rebbe says, first of all, the Rambam, if he doesn't have to, when he copies down his sources, he tries not to change them. But second of all, I'm just reading here from a little write-up of the Rebbe's words here, saying that this sukkah is like a home brings out the level of disqualification much more. Because the whole idea of a sukkah, it's actually one of the mitzvahs that we have to think about, the reason as we sit in them, is to remember the fact that Hashem put us into huts when we were in the desert. A home is the direct opposite of such a sukkah, of such a hut. So when I tell you, making a sukkah under a tree is like making a sukkah in your home, the level of extremity is communicated in a much harsher way. It doesn't just say it's disqualified. It's like making it into a home, inside a home. It's basically like not having a sukkah at all. So you have to be very careful when you construct your sukkahs, that there shouldn't be any leaves or live trees hanging over it. What happens if you have a case similar to the one we saw before in this slideshow? Let me bring it up here. Pumpkin vine, yes? Coming around the sukkah. V'sikech al gaban. Then, you didn't just use the vine. You added more schach on top of that. Ve'achar kach kitzatzan. And then you also went ahead and cut these vines at their source. So, follow the steps here. You put on the vines while they were in a disqualified state. They were attached to the ground. Then you added more kosher schach on top of that, plus you detached the non-kosher schach from their source. Says the Rambam, if the kosher schach, that was always kosher, is more in quantity than the disqualified schach originally, kshera, the entire thing now remains kosher. But if the initial kosher schach was not more in quantity than the newly kosher schach, the one that was just now detached after it was hung, you must go ahead and every detached vine, you must shake it, move it about, so it should be made for a sukkah. When they were first draped over in their disqualified state, they were in a sukkah. Simply by cutting them, that's like a sukkah coming about on its own accord. That would be a disqualified sukkah. By shaking them, moving them around for the express purpose of being used for a sukkah, now you make them kosher. By the way, there's another application of this law in which many times people have big sukkahs where non-Jewish workers are hired to construct the entire thing. They put up the entire wall, and they also put up all the coverings, the bamboo mats or the bamboo pieces or the schach pieces. And it's important to know that a Jew afterwards should go ahead and move all the pieces of schach to construct the schach for the purpose of the mitzvah. Because the non-Jewish Gentile doesn't have that power to confer upon the schach the mitzvah status. Only a Jew can do that. And so a Jew must move the schach afterwards. Yud Gimel. You made a mishmash. You mixed together something which is kosher for schach and something non-kosher for schach, and of them both, you made a covering for the sukkah. Not side by side like we had before with the boards. One big mix. Even if quantitatively speaking, there's more kosher schach than non-kosher schach, psula, the whole sukkah is disqualified. But if you had made a concoction of schach on your sukkah, from kosher and non-kosher, one beside the other, now there's a whole new set of laws. And the Rambam begins, it goes as follows. If in one space, concentrated, there are 3 tfachim, 3 handbreadths straight of non-kosher schach, bein be'emtza, bein min atzad, whether in the middle of the sukkah, on the side of the sukkah, harezu psula, it's a disqualified sukkah. 3 tfachim, 3 handbreadths of non-kosher schach, is considered important enough, prominent enough to disqualify the sukkah. When do we say that? Besukkah ketana. If it's a small sukkah, meeting the minimum requirements of size, 7 by 7 tfachim. Aval besukkah gedela, but if it's a bigger sukkah, and by big, the Rambam will soon define, it means that if you took all the non-kosher schach into account, there would still be left the minimum required area of a sukkah, 7 by 7 tfachim. So now it's a big sukkah, there's more room for leniency. Schach pasul be'emtza. If the non-kosher schach is in the middle of the sukkah, poishla barba tfachim, it requires 4 tfachim, 4 handbreadths of non-kosher schach straight to disqualify it. Pachis mikein kshera, less than that it's kosher. Umin hatzad, and if the non-kosher schach is on the side, and it's a big sukkah, we get a massive leniency. Paisel ba'arba amos. It only disqualifies the sukkah if there are 4 amot, 4 cubits, about 6 feet of straight non-kosher schach. Upachis mikein kshera, less than that will be kosher. We'll see in a moment, this is a halacha l'Moshe misinai, a law directly transmitted from Moses on Mount Sinai. Ketzad, what would this look like? Give me an example. Bayis shenifchas be'emtza. You have a home that caved in the roof in the middle of the house. V'sikech al makom apchas, and you put schach over the caved-in area. V'chein chatzer hamukefes achsadra, or if you have a patio area, which is surrounded by a little structure on which schach can be laid. Shasikech aleh, and you put schach on top of it. But on the sides, there's proper structure, non-kosher schach. V'chein sukkah gedola, or just a regular big sukkah. Sheikifur b'davar she'ein mesakhin bay b'tzadat fanes milamayla, that you surrounded. In other words, the outer edge, where the walls are flush with the schach, was covered with things that are not kosher to be used for schach. Im yesh misvas haschach hakosher v'la koisel arba amos. If from the point where the kosher schach begins to the edge of the wall there are 4 amot or more, 4 cubits or more, 6 feet or more, psula, it's disqualified. Pachis mikein, but less than that, royin ki'ilu hakoisel nekam. We simply treat it as though the wall is tilted. V'yechashiv zeh haschach haposel miguf hakoisel ukshera. And the non-kosher schach up to a length of width of 4 amot will be considered to be simply an extension of the wall, and it's kosher. V'davar zeh halacha l'Moshe misinai. This is one of the laws directly from Moses on Mount Sinai, which governs the laws of Sukkah. It's called in the Talmud dofen akuma, the crooked wall, in which the Talmud states that when you have a big sukkah, up to 4 amot, directly from the side, is considered to be just more of the wall. Again, if it's in the middle, 4 tfachim disqualifies it, or 3 if it's a small sukkah. On the side, you get more leniency with a big sukkah. Tesva, ve'ezoi sukkah ketana. What is defined as a small sukkah? Kol she'ein ba'al shiva tfachim al shiva tfachim, if it only has a measurement of 7 by 7 tfachim, the minimum required width and length for a sukkah. Ugedaila, what's defined as a big sukkah? Kol she'yishayer ba, yesed al schach hapasul, shiva tfachim al shiva tfachim schach kosher. Any case in which it will remain, in addition to all the non-kosher schach, there will remain 7 by 7 tvachim of kosher schach. That's called a big sukkah. Tezayin, sikech b'davar pasul b'davar kosher, zeh b'tzad zeh. If you put schach, you layered schach, something non-kosher, something kosher, one next to another. And there's no one place where there's a concentration of 3 tfachim of non-kosher schach. There's no one place where you can point and say, this disqualifies the sukkah. If the total quantity of the kosher schach measured more than the total quantity of non-kosher schach, kosher, it's kosher. But if it was equal quantity, exactly equal quantity, even though there's no one place where you can point to and say, here is 3 tfachim of non-kosher schach, the whole sukkah is disqualified, because for this law, we're going to treat non-kosher schach as simply open space. When you have 50-50 open space and covered space in a sukkah, you got an issue of more sun than shade. And so the sukkah is disqualified. If a person has fully kosher schach, but then he covers his sukkah with a tarp, or with a sheet, or with a cloth, or under the schach, within your sukkah, you laid a cloth to catch the falling leaves, psula, your sukkah is now disqualified because you're sitting not under schach, you're sitting under another covering. If the only reason you spread out this cloth or sheet was to beautify the sukkah, kshira, now the sukkah is kosher. Similarly, if you had covered your sukkah properly, and you decorated it, you didn't layer a cloth. You simply decorated it with types of utensils, types of fruits, delicacies, shetluyin that were hanging, whether off the walls or off the covering, since they were done for beauty, kshira, it's all kosher. Even though when you look up, you see tons of decorations, you don't see the schach, we don't consider it to be an interruption. Yudches, noye sukkah, decorations of a sukkah, ein memahatin begava. They don't reduce, they don't decrease the total height of a sukkah. Avol memahatin berachba, but they could reduce, they could decrease the width of a sukkah. For example, you have a minimum sukkah, 7 by 7 tfachim, and you hang a nice little picture frame on the side of the sukkah. That reduces the size of the sukkah, and the full width now is not what's required. Versus if you had hung a carpet, let's say, as decoration to the sukkah, we don't consider now the sukkah to be lower than whatever size it was. But if there was a separation of at least 4 tfachim, 4 handbreadths or more, before you hung the decoration, so the schach is here, 4 tfachim, 4 handbreadths down. Here, you hang the decorations, psula, now your sukkah is disqualified. Shenimtza, for it turns out, shahayoyshev sham, that somebody's sitting in your sukkah, ki'ilu eine tachas haschach, el tachas hanoyim. He's not under the schach, he's sitting under decorations. Shein oichlin v'kelim, shein mesakchem behen, foods and utensils, which cannot be used for schach. Yutes schach shahayu by chalonis shaha'aver nira mehen. What if you had kosher schach, but you had some airspace, pockets of airspace, where you can simply see the sky? If the total quantity of open airspace is equal to that of the covered space, the schach, the sukkah is disqualified. Because in a 50-50 case, on the bottom of the sukkah, when you look at the shadows, the sun will be more than the shade. And whenever we have more sun than shade, it's not considered a covering. But if the total quantity above of the covered space was more than the open space, it's kosher. Says the Rambam, immediately we qualify this. When do we say this? If there isn't one pocket that has 3 tfachim of open airspace, 3 handbreadths. But if there's one pocket of airspace, open air, that has 3 tfachim, 3 handbreadths open, whether in the middle or on the side, the entire sukkah becomes disqualified, even if everything else is covered. But you have 3 tfachim of open airspace, disqualified, you got to reduce that to being less than 3 tfachim. If you then reduced the open airspace with something that is disqualified from use as schach, so you're kind of using the halacha against itself, right? Because airspace disqualifies the sukkah at a measurement of 3 tfachim. Non-kosher schach disqualifies the sukkah at a measure of 3 tfachim. What did you do here? You have 3 tfachim of open airspace. You cover a tefach and a half with a pillow or a blanket. So now you put disqualified schach, but each one is less than 3 tfachim. Says the Rambam, if you were to reduce the open airspace with something which is non-kosher for schach, like pillows or blankets, if it's a big sukkah, you're good. It's kosher. But if it's a small sukkah, the minimum required amount, you can't go and start putting in disqualified schach and expecting it to take care of a pre-existing issue. It's disqualified until you reduce it with something that's kosher, acceptable to be used as schach. If most of the schach, you look at a regular sukkah, most of the area is more shade than sun. And only in a small space there's more sun than shade. Since in the totality of the issue, the shade of the entire sukkah is more than the sum total of the sun in the sukkah, it's kosher. The proper way of the schach is that it should be light, a light covering, such that you should be able to see through it big stars. If you made the schach thick, like a home would be a thick roof, even if you can't see the stars, it's still kosher. The bottom line is you have a roof, which is a temporary roofing. If the schach was uneven, and by uneven we mean your schach was placed on the sukkah in layers, actual layers at different heights. You have a little picture here. You can see it. Literally different layers of heights of the sukkah. Kosher, it's kosher. Provided that between the levels there isn't an open airspace of 3 tfachim. But if the width of a particular layer was 1 tefach, 1 handbreadth or more, even if the height between it and the next layer is more than 3 tefachim, we treat it as though the layers are simply flush. Even if 1 layer is here and 1 layer is here, if the layers are each a handbreadth wide, we have a principle in halakha called chavot rimi, which means lower and raise, and you basically consider it to all be aligned. So long as it's actually flush, each layer is flush with the edge of the next layer. If they're not flush, if one's higher than the other, then we can't say the principle of lower and raise because then they'll crash. So then If you have more than 3 tefachim of space in between, it would be disqualified. Chav Bey is ha'isa sukkah al gabe sukkah. If somebody constructs one sukkah on top of another, hatachtoina psula, the bottom sukkah is disqualified. Kimisha asa sukkah b'sei chabayis, as if you made a sukkah in the home. V'ha'al yena kshera, the top one is kosher. It's under the open sky. When do we say that the bottom sukkah is disqualified? If number one, the height of the upper sukkah was the requisite amount, it had a height of 10 tefachim or more, and the roof of the top sukkah could hold pillows and blankets from somebody in the top sukkah, even if it's done with difficulty. In other words, the point is the roof of the bottom sukkah could be used as a bed, as a support for somebody living in the top sukkah. That's when the top sukkah becomes fully functional and disqualifies the bottom sukkah. But if the height of the top sukkah isn't the requisite amount, it isn't 10 tefachim, so it anyways isn't a kosher sukkah. Or the bottom covering wasn't strong enough to hold, even with difficulty, to hold pillows and blankets placed upon it by the upper sukkah. So it's basically considered nothing. Then the bottom sukkah becomes kosher. Of course, provided that the total height isn't 20 amot, which is disqualified for other reasons. For in this case, the bottom sukkah will become permitted through the schach, the covering of the top sukkah. We treat it as one big sukkah, and it's all good. Because there's no functionality which divides them. The schach on top of the bottom sukkah cannot even hold stuff in the top sukkah. Chav Gimel, similar principles. Mita shebeseicha sukkah. If you have a bed in your sukkah, people sleep in the sukkah. You have a bed in the sukkah. Im gevaya asara tfachim. If the height of the bed is 10 tfachim tall, which is the height of a regular sukkah, hayoshev tachteha liyatzei yedei chevaseh. If somebody were to sit under the bed, he's not in the sukkah. Doesn't fulfill his obligation. Mipnei sheike sukkah b'seich sukkah, because that's treated like a sukkah in a sukkah. The bed in the sukkah. V'chein kilo sheyesh lagag afilu tefach. Similarly, a canopy over a bed. If it has a roof, at least the width of a tefach, certainly if it's a bigger canopy, im gevaya asara tfachim. If the height of the canopy from the surface of the bed is 10 tfachim tall, ein yeshenim babasukkah. You cannot sleep on that bed in a sukkah because you aren't in the sukkah. And similarly, if a person simply constructs 4 pillars in a sukkah and puts a canopy over them, im gevayin asara is like a sukkah b'seich sukkah. If it's 10 tfachim tall, that's like a sukkah in a sukkah, and sitting under it is disqualified. But if you have just 2 pillars upon which you laid a sheet over it, there's no width of 1 tefach, there's no proper roof, there's no proper canopy, or a canopy over a bed, which doesn't have the roof width of 1 handbreadth, even if their height is, no matter how high, you can sleep under them in a sukkah. It isn't a sukkah inside a sukkah, because every sukkah needs a roof. This sukkah, second sukkah, doesn't have a roof. Sukkah she'ula kshera, a borrowed sukkah. You borrow the rights to go in someone's sukkah, it's kosher. Surprisingly, even a stolen sukkah is kosher. And there's 2 ways to steal a sukkah. Stealing the real estate or the material. Ketzah, what does it look like to steal a sukkah? Im takaf al chaveira, if you overpowered your friend, took him out of his sukkah, ugzala v'yashaba, stole it, claimed it as yours, and sat in the sukkah, yatsa, you are fulfilling your obligation. She'ein hakarka nigzelas, because you cannot steal real estate. So you, in effect, didn't steal anything. You're just sitting in your friend's sukkah, which is okay. Even if you stole the materials, and you made a sukkah for yourself out of it, yatsa, you have also fulfilled your obligation. Because the sages said, in general principle, when a person steals wood, the person who it was stolen from only has a claim to money, not to the actual material. We'll see this more in the 12th book of the Rambam, where there's laws about, or the 11th book of the Rambam, laws about thievery and robbery. Typically, you have to replace the object which you stole. But when it comes to wood, the sages said, you only owe the money. So in a way, when you stole the wood, it became yours. So you made a sukkah out of your own stuff, which is okay. Even if you stole raw boards, and you placed them down, you constructed them, you didn't attach them, you didn't nail them down, you didn't make any changes to them whatsoever, yatsa, you've still fulfilled your obligation, it becomes yours, it's no longer considered the other person's. If you construct a sukkah in the public domain, it's also considered to be yours, Doesn't have to be on your property, and it's a kosher sukkah.